woodland people of the native peoples, such as the Miami, the Potawatomi, the Shawnee, the Lenape. And when I do this as a Native woman, I'm originally from the Navajo Nation, and we often do our own type of land acknowledgement, but we get this question all the time. And when I do lectures with students across campus, I always think it's important because this gets the students as well as everybody to start thinking, who were the original people that occupied the land before it became Indiana, or even before it became Purdue University. And that always drums up a lot of different conversations with people across campus. So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Lauren Zanotti. She's going to begin and talking with our first group of panelists. Okay, Laura, tossing it over to you.
Great, thank you so much for that warm welcome. I am an associate director at the Center for the Environment, and my disciplinary home is in the Department of Anthropology. We have 4 speakers in the first part this morning. Each will speak for about 5 minutes, and then there'll be an opportunity for Q&A. So I'd like to introduce the first speaker, which is Dr. Corey Cooper, who's an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at Purdue.
Great. So I'm an archaeologist in the Department of Anthropology, and although more local Native American cultures aren't my area of expertise, I'm going to be talking about Prophetstown. And I have a visual. Let me see if I can share this here. Okay, this admittedly uninspiring visual is actually a result of a lot of my recent thinking on how land acknowledgements, which have been going on for a very long time in certain contexts, have become more common in recent years. And also my thinking about the recent attention given to the fact that land grant universities were, such as Purdue, were started with money that was the result of the federal government's sale of native land, some of which at one point was designated reservation land. So, so this visual is to try to encourage you to think about where our community sits, Lafayette, West Lafayette, and Purdue University, within at least 2 places that were important to Native people in the area, although Native people were up and down the Wabash River for thousands of years. So archaeological evidence confirms the presence of Native people in what would be the state of Indiana by at least 12,000 years ago. My presentation is just a brief overview of the history of Prophetstown from what is, of course, a non-Native perspective. And I was going to talk about some major events in North America in the late 18th and 19th centuries that created the community of Prophetstown. The first mention of Native peoples in Indiana in non-Native accounts was a reference in 1691 to the presence of Miami people in the Wabash River Valley. So in the bottom corner of the visual, there's an arrow pointing to Fort Ouiatenon. Fort Ouiatenon was established as a fur trade post by the French in 1717 along the banks of the Wabash River, and it was across the river from a major settlement of the Wea, who are often referred to separately from the Miami, although they are linguistically related. The first non-Native mention of Indigenous occupation at the mouth of the Tippecanoe River, so that's the arrow up at the top, shows where the Tippecanoe River runs into the Wabash River, was in a letter written in 1733 by the Commandant of Detroit, who was informed that a village at this location, a village of Miami at this location, was almost completely wiped out by smallpox. There were just a few survivors. Skip ahead to the French and Indian War, which took place from 1754 to 1763. This pitted the British against the French, the British and their colonial allies, and the French and their native allies. And the French were wanting to keep Britain out of the lucrative fur trade. But the British won this conflict, and officially they took possession of all French holdings in Canada and then east of the Mississippi in what would eventually become the United States. Immediately following this conflict, there was another conflict that ensued, and this was a rebellion led by the Ottawa chief Pontiac. And this uprising included many native people who had been allies of the French, such as the Shawnee, the Delaware, the Miami, the Wea, Potawatomi, and others. This rebellion was put down in 1764, but one of the results was the Proclamation of 1763. And the British monarchy, in issuing this proclamation, in order to keep peace with native people, they basically limited westward expansion any further west than the current boundaries of the colonies. Because the British monarchy was getting tired of spending money on troops that were needed to support the colonies whenever colonists started conflicts with native people over land. So ahead again to the late 1770s. By this time, trading activity at Fort Ouiatenon seems to have shifted to a community referred to as Tippecanoe, which is 25 kilometers upstream on the Wabash, which would eventually become known as Prophetstown. And by the 1770s, Potawatomi were also living around the mouth of the Tippecanoe River, so we have at least Miami and Potawatomi people living here. So by this point in time, Native people had been getting forced off their land by Europeans for quite a while prior to the Revolutionary War, but this really speeded up in the latter 18th century, especially once the Revolutionary War was over. Many people were coming from Europe, including England, in hopes of actually acquiring land, which was almost impossible to do in England at that time. The rule of primogeniture meant oldest sons and families inherited all of a family's wealth and all of the land. And between that and the nobility, England's 1%, if you will, owning large tracts of land, it was very difficult to acquire land in England. And that's what encouraged a lot of people to come to the Americas. Except once people got here, they realized the nobility were doing the same thing. They were giving each other large land grants. And so many people found themselves in sort of the same position. And some were willing to do anything, including start conflicts with Native people to acquire land. So after the end of the Revolutionary War in 1783, the Proclamation of 1763 no longer applied. And it probably wasn't really followed much anyway when it was officially the law. So settlers began to push west in ever larger numbers at the end of the Revolutionary War. And one way this was done was through land grants given to Revolutionary War veterans. Continental Army didn't have funds to pay its soldiers, so they promised land to anyone who would fight the British. But the new US government was so eager to push west, they even awarded land grants to the enemy, not Native people who they viewed as the enemy, but others. So for instance, one of my ancestors by the name of Wilhelm Reinhardt was a German mercenary, one of 30,000 that the British sent to the Americas to help put down the colonial rebellion. About 6,000 stayed behind once the war was over. And my ancestor was one of these individuals. And so he was taken prisoner at some point during the Revolutionary War, but when it was over, he was given a land grant. And I point this out when I teach about these topics in my classes, because I think it's a really good historical example of how white privilege works. So he fought for the other side, but because he was European, at the end of the war, he was given a land grant. He was granted land that had belonged to Native people in New York. Because the proclamation of 1763, many people felt that supporting Britain during the Revolutionary War was the best way for them to avoid getting pushed off their lands. However, at the end of the war, Native people who supported the British were not given an opportunity for peace, but were instead, communities were attacked and people were forced off of their land. And so this is part of why you have many Native communities at this time period were composed of multiple different ethnic groups of people who had been steadily pushed west. And so Prophetstown is a really good example of this type of community in the late 18th, early 19th century, one of these multi-ethnic communities. Skip ahead to 1808. This is when the Shawnee brothers Tecumseh and Tinxwatawa and their Shawnee followers left Ohio and joined this multi-tribal community at Prophetstown. So Tecumseh was the political military leader of an effort to create a pan-Native American resistance to the westward expansion of European settlers that ideally was going to include groups from the Great Lakes all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. Tinxwatawa was the prophet for whom Prophetstown was named. And so whereas Tecumseh, again, was the political military leader, the younger brother, Tinxwatawa, he was the spiritual leader of a revitalization movement that encouraged unity among Native people and discouraged acculturation. But the confederacy that Tecumseh envisioned did not happen, was not successful. And even though the 1811 Battle of Tippecanoe, which took place very near to the site of Prophetstown, it did not end Native occupation of Prophetstown or the region, but within a couple of decades, many, though again, not all, Native people had left the region either on their own in search of a place to live in peace, or were later forcibly removed after Congress passed the 1830 Indian Removal Act. So the history of the United States is really, is in large part the history of conflicting views of land use and land ownership between Native peoples and Europeans. Whereas Europeans have historically viewed the natural and supernatural worlds as two separate, distinct things, and have viewed humans as also separate from nature. For many Native cultures, all three, the natural, supernatural, and human worlds, are one and the same. And we are all interacting with all three worlds simultaneously. So Prophetstown as a multi-tribal community of survivors of conflict with Europeans, it's similar to many other Native communities during that time period, but its role in the efforts of the last major organized resistance of Native people east of the Mississippi in countering the westward expansion of settlers and trying to prevent the further loss of their land. This makes Prophetstown a really unique and special place to think about on Earth Day and to consider how capitalist exploitation of land in the past and now endangers our collective future as humans.
Great, thank you so much. That was a wonderful introduction. I'd like to now introduce Dr. Victor Mack, historian and former Tecumseh postdoctoral fellow at the NAECC and current program manager at the Discovery Park Center for the Environment and the Nexus Institute. And as Victor's getting set up here, I just wanted to remind folks that you can pose questions in the chat box. If we run long, we'd be happy to try to answer those questions or keep them as an archive for a later response. Victor?
Thank you, Laura. Thank you very much. And thank you for the NAECC and the C4E for this wonderful panel. It's a privilege for me to be in and to discuss the importance of Native American communities. In this day, we remember to honor the earth. Particularly to discuss the figures around Prophetstown, such a symbolic area in our area, as Corey just pointed out. In 1841, biography titled "The Life of Tecumseh and His Brother the Prophet," Benjamin Drake wrote, "Tecumseh, the great Indian leader, and his brother the Prophet, a crafty impostor." Since then, this perception has been mostly perpetuated in people's imagination in different ways. They, of course, as Corey just pointed out, they were much more interesting and complicated than that. I would like to briefly invite you to see them as a synthesis of their time, the late 1700s and early 1800s. Tecumseh and his brother experienced the effects of life in communities that in 2 centuries have lived under the rule of the Spanish, the French, the English, and the emerging American government. By 1810, Tecumseh and his brother in their mid-40s have lived under an endemic warfare against the ever-growing push of the white Americans to the West and internal confrontations with other native tribes. As many others, they also lost their father in one of these battles. In this revisit to their period, I would like to point out 3 key aspects. One, the still looming darker side of Columbian exchange, which meant from the outside, the imposition of, quote unquote, the civilizing mission to removal of people into reservations, instruction, indoctrination of religious beliefs. Removal into reservations were accompanied by policies forcing women to sewing, weaving, and knitting instead of farming, which was the terrible draining of skills in farming, because in most of these communities, women had the know-how of farming. Indian men were also forced to do European-style farming instead of hunting and fishing. Now, from the inside, there was a process also, a growing adoption of European-style clothes, food, whiskey, rum, beef, salt, sugar, tools that were introduced and adopted into the communities became tremendously dependent on. Also, muskets, firearms that fueled internal disputes. Second, factionalism. The divide and conquer policy appeared effective, since made many chiefs accommodate to the government in exchange of money and goods into called annuity, and their chiefs accommodated into this process were called, in fact, annuity chiefs. Yet, large sectors maintained deep resentment against the white encroachment of their lands and the atrocities in the process. 3, resistance for an autonomous Indian society, which brings us back to our topic of today, to honor the earth. Tecumseh and the Prophet organized a confederacy in defense of the lands they considered theirs and sacred. In radical opposition to the European views of land as mainly private property to exploit, they based their resistance on deeply ingrained collective views. Politically, they claimed that lands were granted to them by their ancestors to provide nourishment to everyone in the community. Religiously, that they in return must honor and celebrate the land as a sacred being to preserve harmony between people and the creation. Native communities have been recognized for millennia for cultivating biodiversity. Instead of a few super crops, organic instead of industrial production. Yet, as Jared Diamond, Charles Mann, and others have argued, they paid dearly whenever overexploitation and massive impact was done. I think in this day of that we remember Honor Earth Day, the arguments and the views of Tecumseh and the Prophet brings us back to the importance of how do we have an organized access to land and the sacred dimension of the land as well. Ancha sumak, as we say, thank you, and my Quechua Andes of Peru. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victor. Our next speaker is Dr. Sarah McMillion, an associate professor in ABE.
So much, Laura. I'm also going to share my screen. I have a few slides that I think, because my work is really on the ecological aspects of this land, it really helps to show some maps and some pictures. As they say, those are worth 1,000 words. So like Corey's picture, I show the same one, but with some greenness underneath. So although there's no notice of where things are, here's the Prophetstown State Park. And the interesting thing about this from an ecological perspective is that it's situated right at the confluence of the Wabash River Basin and the Tippecanoe River. So this area historically would flood frequently, and so what has happened over a long period of time is that has kind of been changed because of the way we've managed our landscape. So in order to kind of understand that and kind of link this back to some of the topics today, I want to zoom out a little bit first and kind of show you what the surrounding landscape looks like from just the perspective of what we see today. So water that is that historically allowed for movement of goods and services and peoples and those kinds of things, now we think of more as either an impediment to agricultural production or a transporter of things like excess water that affects us in floods, or enhancing or maybe degrading the quality of our water as it moves through these river systems. So the Wabash River Basin is quite large. Even at this blue point where the Prophetstown Park is located, we're already up to about 7,000 square miles. But if you look at the entire Wabash Basin, we're about right there. So a small chunk of it at this point. So quite a big system. The landscape around Prophetstown and in most of Indiana before settlement was really primarily marshy wetlands and lots of forest. So the high spots would be farmed. There was a fair bit of that happening, but a lot of wetlands remained in the landscape that would be great habitat for a lot of the various kinds of fauna that lived in this area. And then as this area became more and more settled and we developed it, the system that you can see when you go outside now that has drainage canals and tile drainage was put in place to allow those lands to be drained. And so now we have a watershed that's predominantly agricultural in nature. And so what we're working on is trying to think about how these formerly wet systems, things like these wetlands and forests, can be restored in the nearby areas of the floodplain. And I want to spend just a few minutes talking about why floodplains are so important. So they're right along the area of that confluence. And even though they often are just that area near the river, they tend to occupy a small proportion of the landscape, but a disproportionately large portion of the function of a lot of key ecosystem functions that we rely on as humans. Floods replenish food sources for animals and plants and even the microbes that live in the soils. And they improve water quality by allowing waters to slow, rivers flow into them, and they trap pollutants there. And these wide floodplains that trap pollutants and allow water to slow down also have historically allowed for these areas to become very fertile ground for settlement of just peoples in general. They're important for prime locations for agriculture. So while they're risky in terms of agriculture because they flood relatively frequently, they also are quite productive lands in their own right. And so to kind of mitigate that risk, historically what has happened in many of the rivers in the US is that these are managed, this risk is managed by draining the areas in the watershed, like I mentioned, for various uses, as well as protecting nearby lands, particularly towns, with series of levees, which are higher elevations along the riverbank. And you can kind of see this in this photograph here. The Wabash Basin, this is the Wabash River near where we are in Lafayette, but essentially you have a very robust line of trees, but it's relatively narrow, and then agriculture right in the background. And these can be levied either through natural ways, by just deposition and natural river process, or things like roads and rivers that levees that keep those roads above the river stage. And that kind of keeps the river in its banks, and it minimizes that access to the floodplain, bringing all those services really into a minimum in that way. So what we're trying to think about in our group, in our research, is thinking about, again, how we might restore these. And in partnership with the staff at Prophetstown and several folks at DNR and the Indiana Department of Environmental Management, we're working on how to manage these systems. So I'll briefly talk about this area, and I'm going to try to show this little map here quickly. Where we have this confluence is where this water, or the wetland, has been restored through some efforts that have happened at the park. And essentially what we're working on is how they can restore some of the hydrology to create a system that looks like this beautiful wet prairie ecosystem that does all those functions, restores the flood river connection to improve water quality and connect ecosystems for diversity of plants and animals. Primarily how they did that was removing tile drainage, removing a lot of the altered hydrology, and trying to provide space for those native species to occupy. And lastly, I just wanted to show some really quick, maybe it'll work, sorry, photos, because what's happened during these flood pulses is these happen during the winter time of the year, primarily entering into spring. And many of you see this as you drive over 65 and you see the system flooded. And so when these flood these native areas, they're actually functioning well, but oftentimes they flood agricultural lands, and it tends to create different conditions that we maybe don't want to happen as much. So here's some of the pictures of that restoration site where you can see the flood waters coming in and providing those those water quality and ecological benefits. So with that, I think I'll end and pass it off to the next speaker.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Our final speaker in this section before we start part 2 is Dr. Kenneth or Ken Ridgway in EAPS, professor in EAPS.
Okay, can you hear me? What I'm going to be talking about is this concept of the intersection of geological and cultural dams at Prophetstown and how that's connected to the land itself. So we'll start by talking about geologic dams. And this is a picture over kind of at the western end, the eastern end of the park. The modern river is over here. The modern Wabash River is here.
Ken, I'm
Yep.
sorry to interrupt you. It seems like you're trying to share your screen. We don't.
Okay, so as I said, I want to talk about this combination of cultural and geologic features that defines Prophetstown. And we're going to start with the geologic dam idea. And if you look at Prophetstown, northern Indiana has been covered by ice sheets periodically throughout the last 1.8 million years. And Prophetstown is really the result of the rivers that were out in front of those glaciers. So I'm standing on a terrace here in Prophetstown, looking down at a wide terrace here, and this is the main terrace, main river terrace through Prophetstown that I'll be talking about. And then the modern river is over here along this cut bank. If you look at the sediment throughout Prophetstown area, this is right after in the spring. So if you, even in the woods, what you'll see are these really poorly sorted but rounded gravel. So these are clasts that were being carried by these glacial rivers that were out in front of these ice sheets. And the main fluvial terrace at Prophetstown was created about 17,000 years ago. And this pink line shows where the ice was, about 2,000 feet of ice. And there was a large lake there. It was the ancestral part of Lake Erie. And the dam for that was right here at Fort Wayne. And so here's the location of Fort Wayne. And we're located over in this area. But if you drive along the Heartland Corridor, for instance, what you'll see is as you drive towards Fort Wayne, a number of high ridges. And each one of those ridges represents where the glacier was for a long enough period of time that it could deposit a lot of sediment there. And these are called moraines. When it, at 17,000 years, it was up here at Fort Wayne, where present Fort Wayne is now, and there was a catastrophic flood as that whole lake emptied. And you can see relics of that major flood, like this is at Prophet's Rock out at the park. And I'm standing and my hand is kind of showing some large foresets. So this is a large gravel bar in the middle of the river. And this is the class size that it was carrying during this catastrophic flood that created the main part of Prophetstown. And if you look at, this is in Prophetstown as well, the confluence of the Tippecanoe is right there. And the river is still trying to get back into equilibrium here from all this glacial debris that was deposited. So if you look at the Wabash River, it's what we call a meandering river. It's a sinuous river, but in the middle of it, there's these large gravel bars that look like what we call braided rivers, rivers that are carrying a lot of sediment next to mountains. So this whole river system is still adjusting. And like the last speaker talked about, it's also adjusting because all the wetlands that were around it at one time have been drained. And so all that water off the fields automatically comes into the Wabash River. The Miami tribe name for this river was it shines white, or it's pure white, and it was related to the shells and the rocks that were underneath that you could see through. So this river has been modified significantly. I want to link that with this idea of cultural dams. And so this is the circle of stones at the park, and it represents the 14 main tribes that were here. And Carrie was talking about this. There were many other tribes as well, but in smaller numbers. So this was a place basically where the Eastern Woodland tribes were being dammed. If you look at this slide, and this was a little bit later than the Battle of 1811. So this is 1829 to 1850. And you start to see this mass relocation of Native people to Oklahoma, Kansas, and some of their pathways. But you'll see for many of the tribes that we're talking about at Prophetstown that were in this area here, the Shawnee, the Delaware, they came through, maybe 10, 15 years earlier, but were located right here at Prophetstown. And so these are all people that their culture comes out of the forest, out of the lakes. And basically why this was a cultural dam, in my opinion, is that they knew after this, and this is what Tecumseh was trying to teach people about, was that now if we don't stop here, we're going to end up west of the Mississippi in this arid, dry region with no trees and not part of our culture at all. And so that's why I look at Prophetstown as a cultural dam, just like the landscape and just like it's being modified. And so these two intersections, I think, lead us back to this connection about land and restoring the land and why it's so important and why Prophetstown provides such an opportunity. If you've ever been at Prophetstown at the end of the summer when the grass is high, this high prairie grass, it's truly a magical place, and it's a really rich ecosystem. I've seen animals out there. I walk out here 2 or 3 times every week. And it's probably one of the most diverse ecosystems, along with the Kankakee prairie grass, which has been restored, that we have. So from a Native perspective, from my people's perspective, if the land is doing well, the people are doing well. And that's what's so important about Prophetstown. It gives us a place to start to reclaim these ecosystems. And this is an immature bald eagle. When I'm walking out there and parts of the river are frozen, the eagles will be really concentrated along certain areas where they're fishing. I've seen 7 to 14 eagles sometimes. But I put this slide up here because I think this restoration and what Prophetstown offers us is also that we have to have everyone involved. And so the eagle always, every time I see an eagle at Prophetstown, it reminds me of Rachel Carson. And basically she was a non-Native person that basically took a battle against the Department of Agriculture, the US government, and the ag companies to say DDT is killing all the birds, basically. And they harassed her, talked all about her personal life, but she was right. And so I think Prophetstown gives us the opportunity to bring in Western science, like what Rachel Carson did, the Native people who have also been modified in this outburst of cultural outburst, and also, like the last speaker was talking about, to help restore the land. And so I think that's it. My daughter took these pictures. Some were from the Prophetstown exhibits, and the ones in the summer are the high prairie grass. Right now, the wildflowers are blooming out there, so it's a special place. So thanks.
Great, thanks so much. Again, happy Earth Day, everyone. We're gonna start part 2 now, and I'm gonna hand it back to Felica.
Thanks for all our speakers for providing that historical context regarding the land, Prophetstown and everything. We're going to switch gears, and we want to focus on some of our current scholars that we have. I'm going to switch gears and talk about what we call as the Sloan Indigenous Graduate Partnership Program. And in starting that, I have a quick PowerPoint just to provide you some context as to our Sloan program. We have our Sloan program, come on, here we go. There we go. As I always do with my introductions, just providing greeting from all the different tribal nations that are represented at Purdue. Since we've been taking this census back in 2007, we have over 65 tribal nations that are represented. This includes some of our currently enrolled students, our alums, faculty, and staff, and every year it tends to grow. We are probably up to 70 because I have not had a chance to update some of our newer students that have joined us since the fall semester and included their tribal nations here. But it just shows where our Native people are across the country. This was just a quick overview about Purdue Native initiatives. The Purdue Native American Culture Center opened the doors in 2006 with the formation of the Tecumseh Project. This was an initiative with Native students and faculty key collaborators who are non-native faculty in the STEM discipline. The basic idea was to bring students together to form a Native community. And the reason I bring this up, because it is so tightly intertwined with the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation's Sloan Indigenous Graduate Partnership Program. And this is an initiative to fund graduate students. And I'll go a bit more into detail, but regarding our timeline, we opened our doors in 2007. We had our first director in July 2007. I became the director in 2009. We moved into the Division of Diversity Inclusion in January 2010. And in 2016, we moved to our new location, which is located at University and 5th Street. Little picture about where we are with the Native American Culture Center. What we do is we provide services to students across campus. Many of them consider this their second home. And we have, with our central location, we've been able to expand our services to provide study area, meeting rooms. We've expanded our educational resources, and we do have a fully functional kitchen for cooking demonstrations, and we have students from all across campus that come to visit us. So in that respects, that ties tightly with our Sloan Indigenous Graduate Partnership Program, where we receive funding from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to offer financial and academic support for Native American, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian students who are seeking a master's or doctoral degree in science, technology, engineering, and math. Program benefits we have listed here. Basically, students are given funding that they can apply towards to their academics, and we also have a professional development component where we meet with students on a weekly basis. In addition to that, they have a faculty mentor, but then we also have a Sloan mentor they're able to meet with. Program eligibility, we are closely tied with NACME, and therefore we have to make sure that we have students are eligible to show proof of their Native heritage, that they are pursuing an MS or PhD in a STEM-related discipline, and that they meet the university's requirement for graduate admissions. I have a family here I use as one of my graphics. Nicole and Daniel Bird were two of our more active students who are actively engaged with the center, and Riley was also part of that community. But it really just kind of showed how we had a very cohesive home community. We had kids running around all over the place. And just to continue on with our program highlights, the Sloan program is part of a national initiative with Purdue University serving as the lead institution. Our institutional partners include University of Alaska, both their Fairbanks and their Anchorage campuses, University of Arizona, University of Montana, Montana State, Montana Tech, SUNY, the State University of New York, which includes their College of Environmental Sciences and Forestry, and the University of North Carolina, Asheville. Just to note that SUNY and Asheville were two new institutions that joined our partnership program this past cycle. I'll kind of go into that a little bit more. Since 2007, we have 38 master's and 24 doctoral scholars that have come through Purdue University for a total of 68 graduates. And very impressively, we have a 95% retention rate in getting our students in and out. In March 2020, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation had renewed funding for the scholars, and that's where we added on our new institutions with SUNY and UNC Asheville. Kevin Gibson, Ken Ridgway, and I serve as the co-PIs for the Purdue institution, and I know that Kevin's on board, so if you have any questions, I'll see if I can, hopefully my statistics are right. I'm going to transition, and I have two of our scholars that are here willing to join us. Initially, we have 3 people that were going to be joining us. Another student who is, I should say, a Purdue alum. He resides in a tribal community in New Mexico and wasn't able to join us today just because he does not have reliable technological services. And I guess that's very indicative of what happens in tribal communities or marginalized communities. Many of these many people do not have. He didn't feel comfortable coming on board because he was afraid that his internet services would come and go out. So with that, I'm going to ask Ashley and Derrick to join us. I'm going to go back to my screen here and stop sharing so we can have them join us. I do have a couple of questions that I want to pose to them. First of all, if I could just have them introduce themselves and tell us about their journey to Purdue and what brought you here. So I'll start off with Ashley.
Hi, everyone. Really happy to be here with you today. I am currently a second-year master's student in forestry and natural resources here at Purdue. And I am originally from the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians in the northern peninsula of Michigan. I grew up in Howell, Michigan, which was just southeast of the capital of Lansing. I went to Michigan State for my bachelor's, and I graduated with a degree in fisheries and wildlife and a concentration in conservation biology. My path to graduate school in Purdue was really quick. I graduated in 2018 with my bachelor's in May, and then I started in August of 2018 here at Purdue. I am really active in the Wildlife Society, which is a national professional society in my field. And I am currently the chair of the Native Peoples Wildlife Management Working Group. But I originally got involved as a student with that working group at the National Society and was actually being mentored by several of the different members of our group. And we had Dr. Pat Zollner come and present to us about what it is to be a Sloan Scholar and what some of the opportunities are. And I was really interested. So the fall of my senior year at Michigan State, I came and visited Purdue several times and met with my current advisor, Dr. Liz Flaherty, and it seemed to be a good fit, and I was really excited about coming. My current project that I'm working on is I study northern flying squirrels in West Virginia. I'm studying how their home ranges, so where are they living on the land, and I'm also working with acoustic monitoring. So flying squirrels, if you don't know, actually make acoustic sounds, and they're ultrasonic in nature, so they're above human hearing. And so we use these little monitors to capture the sounds and the noises that we make, and hopefully we're going to be able to use them and use those calls to study occupancy without actually handling them. So we're really excited about that.
Okay, thank you, Ashley. Next, I have Derrick Slick joining us. He may or may not have a video connection. I know he was having some issues, but I know we can hear him. So Derrick, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. My name is Derrick Slick, and I'm from the Navajo tribe. I first started school on a tribal school called the NAECCC College. There I got my Associates of Science degree, and then moved on to Fort Lewis College, where I received my environmental science degree there. After taking a few years off, after getting my bachelor's degree, I was working for the EPA. And then a few years after that, I decided to apply for grad school here at Purdue University. I first learned about Purdue University back in 2012. This is when I first met Flicka and Ken. And this was probably the first time we started talking about ideas of graduate school and ideas for research projects that I would be interested in. So I thought that was really interesting. And I was just at the right place at the right time at the moment. So here at Fort Lewis, I study what I study here at Purdue University is hydrogeology, and my research area is the Arabi Wash, which is located on the Navajo and Hopi Reservation in the Southwest Arizona. I'm going to go ahead and share my slide with you guys. Okay, I'm just going to talk a little bit about my project and what I'm doing. So I'm doing a stable, an isotopic analysis of the Arabi Wash. So since 2018, I've been collecting groundwater and surface water and doing analyses on those, trying to figure out the source of groundwater recharge for these areas. Okay, just a little background of where the Navajo reservation's at and the location of my watershed area I'm currently studying. So this is a map of the Four Corners region in southwestern United States. The boundaries for the Navajo reservation, they're shown in red, and the Hopi reservation is shown in purple there. In my research area, the watershed that I'm currently studying is highlighted in yellow. So I want to talk a little bit about the cultural aspect of Navajo people. Navajo people, they incorporate livestock into their culture as their way of life. So for us to say water is life in Navajo, it means to'e ina'te, which means water is life. Water is what gives you the strength to carry on, and it gives water to our livestock. In return, we harvest them and we respect them, and it's what keeps us healthy, and we understand the importance of water. These are just some of the things that we've been dealing with back on the Navajo reservation. We have a lot of feral horses and cattle, so they just sort of graze wherever they please. And sometimes during the drought seasons, their water is very scarce. So farmers and ranchers that are up there where I do my research, they have these dams that they fence off because they want to save the water for their own livestock. So they'll have a gate and a fence, and when their livestock need water, they'll open up the gates, let their livestock drink water, and then take them back out. So this is just one way that they've been trying to control the conservation of water there. Also, they've been trying to do a lot more farming, sort of like dry drip irrigation. So these are some of the things that we're going through as a tribe. More importantly, climate change and the impacts. We see a decrease in spring discharge, and also we see declining livestock health. These livestock they're just, during drought years, they just don't have enough vegetation to keep them going. So most of the time they just, they catch a disease, or they just get sick, and they just die where they lay. So when I was out doing my research, I saw several cattle lying in ditches and washes. So we're getting hit pretty badly as far as climate change goes. And the whole reason why I started this research was because I knew that in order for the reservation to do future planning, we needed to study watersheds and understand where these recharge areas are and the source of recharge. So I feel like it's going to be very important for my tribe to figure out what we need to do in order to replenish some of these groundwater and bring back some of these springs back to the reservation, because these springs are tied into our culture, our stories, and in our ceremonies and in our prayers. So it's important that we have these springs for our people to continue living the Navajo way of life. On the Navajo reservation, there's two types of precipitation that we receive. There's the winter precip, and there's also the monsoon season. So these are the two seasons that I'm focused on, and I'm primarily interested in which one of these seasons influences recharge the most to springs or groundwater. This is just a graph of a regional precip of the area where I'm at. just to show you where monsoon would be is in red and the winter precip is in blue. As you can see that the winter precip is actually expands longer throughout the month. So it's actually, it takes, winter lasts a few months longer than it does monsoon. Monsoon is just sort of like, just happens very abruptly, and then it you know, shies away. So these are my research questions I've been doing. The question number 1 is, what are the sources of recharge for groundwater in earthen dams? 2, what are the plant-water interactions in a Rabi wash? 3, what are the geologic controls on spring distribution? So this is just a little cartoon of my watershed, and just to give you guys a little background on the type of things that I'm doing on the reservation or within my watershed. So this is a basic water budget component here. You have your basic precip that's coming into the watershed, and you just have a lot of outgoing stuff. So many of the farmers and ranchers, like I said, they have dams within on their grazing sites. And one of the questions I would like to ask is, how are these dams influencing deeper groundwater flow, or are they just evaporating? It was one of the questions I wanted to figure out. Also, the plants, and how do plants play a role within these watershed? Are they actually like just absorbing all the water, or how do they fit into the water budget is the other question that I want to figure out. And throughout the watershed, I have 10 water collectors throughout the watershed that I'm working in. So I've done a total of 6 successful campaigns. So I go out there quarterly, October, December, March, and in the summer. I just finished my last campaign back in October 2019. So now I'm just writing up my thesis and trying to finish up at this point. This just diagram that shows you the intensity of rainfall versus snow. So the blue again is the snow diagram. As you can see, it takes the pathway to the base flow takes it takes longer than it does for high intensity storm events such as like rainfall, because these are very intense storms that just cause flooding and water just runs off. So there's no time for it to infiltrate into the ground. Where snow, it's very gentle, it falls on the ground and it takes its time. So those are one of the 2 precepts that I'm looking at. Here's another map showing my research area. The watershed again is in yellow, and I just wanted to show you guys where I've been collecting my snow and rain precip collectors. Also been collecting groundwater samples and plant samples throughout this watershed. Just wanted to point out one thing. I know that I told you guys that the watershed runs through the Hopi Reservation, but I was unable to get samples within the Hopi Reservation because I did not receive their consent. So show you a few pictures of my rain collectors here. So I have a total of 10 of these throughout my watershed. And I also have snow collectors, which is this big PVC pipe in the background here. This is a picture of one of the springs that I'm studying back on Rabi Wash. These springs just emerge in certain rock outcrops, and normally the livestock in the area and wildlife, they congregate in these areas, so it's very important for them to have this water resource for them. This is another spring just downstream. You can see there's another small little spring just seeping out from near the outcrop. A lot of these waters are enriched in iron. This is another spring higher up in the elevation. That's my research assistant there taking a picture of the spring. And here we take samples of the spring water, the temperature of the water, and we'll take pH levels. I'll also take samples from groundwater wells. We call them windmills. They're basically just these wells that are pumped by windmills, and they're pumped into these storage tanks. And during the drier season, their residents within these areas rely on these storage tanks to provide water for their livestock. And like I said, earthen dams, these are very important because they hold water. A lot of these dams broke, so the communities themselves really don't have the money to go back out here and build these dams. So majority of the time, a lot of these dams are broken and they're just unfixed. So I also collect plant samples throughout the watershed. So I'll collect plant samples in the higher elevation, and I'll collect plant samples within the wash. And my hopes in doing this is try to figure out how the plants are interacting with their precip water, and maybe they could tell me something about their infiltration rate and how deep they're drawing their water from, because these plant species, their roots can grow up to 50 feet deep. Also, this is just a picture showing a runoff. So if I'm lucky and I'm out there and it just so happens to snow or rain, I'll collect rainwater from there as well. Yep. With that, I'll take any questions.
Okay, Derrick, let me go ahead and jump in here. I realize that we have, or over our time of, it's already 6 minutes over. We will continue to I do have one more question I want to pose to our scholars. If you need to leave, we understand, and we hope that you'll be able to join us, but we're going to go ahead and continue just a little bit longer. I did have one more question I wanted to pose to our Sloan scholars, and then we'll open up broadly to the to everybody to offer some questions. My question to our Sloan scholar, and I'll go back to Ashley here. From your perspective as an Indigenous researcher, can you explain why it is important to support research and scholarship in Native communities and in tribal nations?
Yeah, absolutely. So in my opinion, it's really important to support your Indigenous communities, because one of the great things that we can bring to the table is traditional ecological knowledge. And while Western science has been, cataloging and making observations for a very short time, Indigenous communities have been doing observations for generations within their areas and within their communities. And so with that, we're able to, for management or for conservation, we're able to integrate those knowledge, techniques, ideas, and to really bring a wholesome picture for conservation in our areas. I think one of the biggest things is that Indigenous people, and at least in my community, view the environment and man on equal level. So we're not separate from the environment. And I think that's a really important thing. And so with that, I think that Indigenous communities can not only bring new ideas to the table, can also be innovative, but I also think that they bring a way of being and doing that's different from what we currently experience.
Okay, great. And then one question for Derrick. In celebration of Earth Day today, can you share how your research will impact a tribal community and what changes will it make in the environment and ecosystem? You kind of explained it in your PowerPoint, but if you could just, if you have additional comments you'd like to add.
So about 30% of the Navajo residents do not have running water to their houses. So they rely on hauling water from windmills or from watering points. And it's not uncommon for a tribal member to travel one way 20 miles or more on an unpaved road just so they can haul some water back to their house for their livestock and for their own use. And since it's very important to have water, to have basic sanitary plumbing, and just to disinfect and just to keep the disease away, I think that's why it's important we understand how much water is coming into the watershed, and how we can, hopefully the tribe can monitor this better and have a better management for future planning.
Okay, excellent. I really want to thank Ashley and Derrick for joining us today. I know that we didn't have much time to expand upon the research, and again, Ashley and Derrick are just two of our Purdue Sloan scholars that we have at the university. We currently have about 18 scholars in the program, and we're excited that we're going to be, I shouldn't say we're excited, we're kind of sad we're going to be losing one of our scholars. He's going to be defending his dissertation coming up tomorrow, Thursday. So we're excited that he's going to be defending his dissertation. He's going to be one of only, I want to say, 3 or 4 Native Hawaiian mathematicians in the entire country. And so the fact that he's going to be coming from Purdue University kind of shows how, you know, how we have a really good cohort of students that are working with the university, and how the majority of our students tend to, once they graduate, we encourage them to return back to their tribal communities, so that way they can be the new tribal leaders, they can become the new biologists, faculty at their local tribal colleges and universities. And this is a way we want to continue to support our Indigenous communities. So with that, I would like to open it up. I think we're going to unmute, or I'm not sure with the questions coming through, Deb, if Deb's going to be, special thanks to Deb Swihart from our office, who's serving as our moderator. And we will take a look at some of the questions and see if we can answer them. Okay, so right now we have questions. I think the majority of the questions have already been answered, and we just want to go ahead and offer any final comments, because I know that we're way over time. So those of you who stayed through this past our allotted time, we really appreciate you joining. And we will be posting information. This has been recorded, so we'll be able to have it available both on the Center for the Environment's website as well as the NAECC website. Okay, I was going to see if Laura had any last comments that you would like to add.
I just wanted to thank everyone for joining again, and happy Earth Day. This is also something that we'll be working on for future events in 2020 in the fall and or 2021. And so we hope that this is the first of several different events with this theme. And I wanted to thank the speakers again, as well as Philika and Deb for all of their work and support to bring this first virtual event to Purdue.
With that, we're going to officially stop recording, and we'll be here for a little bit longer if you'll have any questions. But again, thank you for coming. And if you want to offer any comments, feel free. Can we unmic people? Because I know we have a smaller group of people here.